Welcome to Reform Thinking. Today, we are taking a deep dive into what is, well, arguably the most pressing long-term challenge facing Ukraine.
It's not about the daily frontline reports.
No, this is about the long game. It's about the people. The people who will be needed to rebuild the nation once the guns finally fall silent.
And when you look at the source material, the figures are truly arresting.
Let's start there. What are the numbers we're looking at?
We're talking about nearly a quarter of Ukraine's pre-war population. That's over 10.5 million people who are currently displaced.
Displaced meaning either registered as refugees abroad or displaced inside the country.
Exactly. And you have to understand, this isn't just a statistic. This is the very core of the future workforce. It's the engine for any kind of economic recovery.
And the foundation for the next generation.
The generational foundation of the entire nation, yes.
So our mission today is to really unpack the sheer scale of this crisis. We're going to analyze the staggering $486 billion price tag for national reconstruction.
And maybe most critically, we need to dissect the government's strategic response.
Right. It's built on three main pillars, and it's designed to reverse not just the damage from the war, but decades of demographic decline that were already happening.
It's an immense task. This is national stewardship on a scale that requires planning over decades, not just a few years.
So to really get a handle on the challenge, we have to start at the beginning. We need to look at the diagnosis.
Let's do that. Because this crisis, this demographic problem, it didn't just appear out of nowhere in February 2022.
No, the long-term trend was already, severely negative. It's a legacy of that post-Soviet transition, which sped up aging and emigration.
That's the critical context that people often miss. After independence in the early 1990s, the population had already fallen dramatically.
From what kind of number?
From above 50 million. And right before the full-scale invasion, the best estimates we have suggest the population in the areas Kyiv controlled was down to roughly 31 to 34 million.
Wow. So we're already looking at a loss of 16 to 19 million people over 3 decades, before the major conflict even kicked off.
Right. The war didn't create the problem. It was like stepping on the accelerator pedal. It just intensified every single negative trend that was already in motion.
Low birth rates, rapid aging, and then this sudden mass emigration.
Correct. And that brings us to the total uprooted population, the heart of the immediate crisis. It sits somewhere between 10.5 and 10.7 million people.
That quarter of the population we mentioned.
That's it. And to understand the solution, you have to understand the breakdown of where these people actually are.
The sources make a really important distinction here between those who fled the country, the refugees, and those who are internally displaced, the IDPs. Let's start with the refugees abroad.
The data points to roughly 6.8 to 6.9 million Ukrainians registered as refugees outside the country.
Okay.
And by early 2025, about 6.3 million of those were recorded specifically in Europe. Within the EU itself, you have about 4 million who are covered by what's called temporary protection status.
And this temporary protection, the sources single this out as a huge factor. It influences whether or not these millions feel any pressure to actually return home.
It's probably the single biggest factor.
So we should dig into that. What does that status actually give a person? What are the rights?
It's a crucial insight. This status, often called TP, was activated by the EU Council back in March 2022. It's not your standard asylum process. It's designed for these kinds of mass influx situations.
So it's faster, streamlined.
Much faster. It offers immediate rights. Critically, it gives you a residence permit, access to the labor market across the entire EU, access to housing, healthcare, and education for your children.
So let's make that real. If you're a mother with 2 kids and you found secure housing, you have a work permit, and your kids are in a German or a Polish school,
then the incentives to stay right where you are become incredibly strong, even if you desperately miss home. You have stability. You have safety.
a baseline of economic viability that, let's be honest, a war-torn region in Ukraine just cannot offer right now.
Precisely. And what's more, the TP status has been extended, which gives people long-term predictability. If the EU were to suddenly withdraw it, you'd see a massive, almost immediate wave of people returning.
But as long as it exists.
As long as it exists, the Ukrainian state has to compete with the social and economic security of the entire European Union. It's a huge challenge.
And then inside Ukraine, you have the IDPs, the internally displaced. Their numbers are also massive, but they often get forgotten in the news cycle.
They do. We're looking at about 3.7 to 3.8 million people who remain displaced within the country's borders.
Where do they come from mostly?
Mostly from the heavily affected eastern and southern regions, about 2/3 from the east alone. And they've resettled in safer central or western parts of the country.
But even though they're still in Ukraine, they're a huge strain on resources.
Of course. They still need housing, social services, new jobs. It stretches the resources of the communities that take them into the breaking point.
And this is where we get to what the sources call the long-term structural damage. It's the demographic skew between who left the country and who was displaced internally.
Yes. The structural damage is, it's profound. The loss isn't uniform across the population.
What do you mean?
The people who cross the borders, the refugees, are disproportionately educated and highly employable. You're talking about young families, doctors, engineers, IT specialists, university students.
The people who could most easily integrate into European labor markets.
Exactly. And so the insight here is that Ukraine is losing its most productive and its most reproductive population segment all at once.
And when you lose that specific demographic, what's the immediate impact on the country they left behind? On the tax base, Social Security, that kind of thing?
The impact is immediate and, frankly, crippling. The population that remained, either in their homes or as IDPs, is now made up mostly of older relatives and men of fighting age who are restricted from leaving.
So you lose the young, skilled workers.
And your tax base shrinks. Your Social Security system faces a much higher burden from an aging population. And critically, your potential for innovation and business growth is just severely curtailed for a generation.
This is the difference between just surviving the war and actually thriving after it.
It is. This demographic imbalance leads us straight to the fertility crisis.
You said the TFR is among the lowest in the world. Can you put that number in context for us?
The total fertility rate, or TFR, dropped from 1.15 children per woman in 2021, which was already low.
Below the replacement rate.
Far below. The replacement rate needed to maintain a stable population is 2.1.
Okay, so it was 1.15.
Then it dropped to around 0.9 in 2022. And current figures for 2024 have it sitting at roughly 1 child per woman.
1, so less than half of what's needed to stay stable. How does that compare to other countries in the region?
A TFR of 1.0 puts Ukraine near the absolute bottom of global rankings. For context, the EU average is around 1.5. Countries we think of as having low birth rates, like Italy or Spain, are usually around 1.25, 1.3.
So this is more than just a slump.
This is characteristic of a demographic collapse. It's compounded by the fact that millions of couples are physically separated and just can't plan families.
And when you put that low fertility rate next to the mortality rate, the raw numbers must paint a pretty grim picture.
They're stark. In 2023, the country recorded about 5.4 births per 1,000 people.
Okay.
Contrast that with the death rate, 15.2 deaths per 1,000 people in the same year.
That's almost a 3-to-1 gap.
It's completely unsustainable. It shows a population structure that was already aging fast, and now that process is being accelerated by the war and the absence of young women.
The sources also point to some of the devastatingly practical causes of this collapse.
Beyond the general instability, you have the immediate reality of physical separation. Husbands are serving at the front, and their wives are often living abroad with the children for safety.
You can't have babies if you're not together.
Fundamentally, no. Then you have the economic anxiety. People postpone huge life decisions, like having a child, when they don't have a stable income.
Of course.
And then there's the direct damage to medical infrastructure. You have clinics and maternity wards that have to operate under constant air raid alarms during blackouts.
It turns what should be a hopeful moment into one of high risk and anxiety.
And that anxiety itself becomes a powerful demographic factor.
So that's the diagnosis. A generational crisis accelerated by war, with the most productive part of the population now living and being educated in the EU.
A very challenging picture.
Which brings us to the price tag for trying to fix it. Let's get into the physical and fiscal scars of the war. The numbers here require some serious long-term thinking.
They certainly do. The total estimated cost for reconstruction and recovery over a 10-year period is an immense figure.
What is it?
$486 billion US.
$500 billion. That requires some clarity. Where does a number like that even come from?
It comes from the 2024 Ukraine Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment. And for credibility, it's crucial to know this was a joint effort.
Who was involved?
The Ukrainian government, the World Bank, the European Commission, and the UN. They used a mix of methods, remote sensing, field visits, local surveys, to estimate the damage across 19 different sectors.
Okay, so when we hear that $500 billion number,
Yeah.
you mentioned it's not just for rebuilding roads and bridges. How much of that sum is actually for the the demographically sensitive sectors, the soft infrastructure that might encourage people to come back.
That's the key breakdown. While hard infrastructure, transport, energy takes up a big slice, the report allocates massive amounts directly to social stabilization.
For example,
For example, the sectors that are critical for demographic recovery: housing, social protection, education, and health, they account for well over a third of the total cost.
so it's a huge part of the plan.
A central part. Housing and compensation alone, just for the 10% of homes that were damaged, is an enormous allocation. It signals that rehoming the displaced is central to the fiscal plan, not an afterthought.
Let's focus on one of those sectors, education. It's the cornerstone of future human capital. The financial loss there is huge.
The sources specify the total estimated loss just to education infrastructure is $13.4 billion.
And what does that look like on the ground?
To visualize it, 3,373 educational institutions have been damaged, and 385 have been completely destroyed. We're talking about more than 10% of all education infrastructure in the country.
1 in 7 schools nationwide.
Yes, and in a frontline region like Kyiv, the situation is just catastrophic. About 40% of schools and kindergartens there have been hit.
So if I'm a mother in Poland and I see those statistics, why would I ever risk bringing my children back to a place where their education would be delivered in a bunker?
And that calculation you just made, that's the direct demographic outcome of the physical damage. The lack of safe, reliable education becomes a strong pull factor, keeping skilled women and their children in the EU.
So fixing the schools isn't just a construction project.
It is a vital, urgent demographic priority. It's about preventing a permanent brain drain.
But despite all these staggering needs, the biggest constraint on Ukraine's ability to finance any of this is the war itself.
The fiscal reality is brutal. Wartime defense and security spending is forecast to be more than 20% of GDP in 2024. That just absorbs the vast majority of all domestic revenue.
Which creates a huge budget deficit.
A deficit that has to be covered almost entirely by foreign aid and borrowing. So all these demographic policies, all the family support we'll talk about, has to exist within these very tight, externally supported constraints.
So sound budgeting isn't just a good idea for the Ministry of Finance. It's a prerequisite to keep donors and citizens confident.
Absolutely. You need transparent financial frameworks that go beyond just the next budget cycle.
You need a plan for the next 5 to 10 years.
Exactly. These frameworks have to clearly show how key sectors, defense, pensions, health, education, reconstruction will be funded. Without that long-term plan, the risk of unsustainable policies is too high and foreign partners will hesitate to commit.
And we are seeing huge external support packages, but this aid is conditional. What are the terms of the IMF and EU support? What are they asking for in return for the money?
The size of the aid is notable. You have a 4-year IMF program of $15.6 billion, and the EU's Ukraine facility approved $50 billion over 4 years.
But there are strings attached.
There are. The money is tied to concrete institutional reforms. The general language is continued reform and transparent spending.
What does that mean specifically?
It means things like accelerating judicial integrity reforms, increasing the independence of anti-corruption bodies, and improving governance in areas like land reform.
Why is something like judicial integrity or land reform relevant to bringing a family of refugees back?
Because it's all about institutional trust. A skilled person from the diaspora isn't going to come back to start a business or buy a house if they're afraid that their legal title is insecure or that the courts are corrupt.
Or that contracts can just be torn up.
Right. The EU and IMF know that institutional stability is the ultimate foundation for a sustainable demographic recovery. It's more important than any single cash payment. The goal is to close the governance gap between Ukraine and the EU.
This analysis really brings us to the core of the government's response. The 3 strategic pillars they've designed. And the sources use an analogy here of building a community around a restored river. The population is the river.
A good analogy. And if we follow that, strategic pillar 1 is about securing the banks of that river. It's titled Creating Secure and Livable Conditions to Bring People Home.
This is the foundation. Everything else rests on this.
It does. It's about making return not just a dream, but a realistic, durable option. That means providing security, housing, jobs, schools, and fair procedures.
We have to start with the absolute non-negotiable: safety. For any durable return, you need security guarantees or tighter integration with Western defense structures.
For sure. For a frontline city like Kharkiv, where 40% of schools are damaged, the strategy has to be really comprehensive. You have to combine strong air defense and shelter infrastructure with extremely fast housing repair.
The security question is about persuading families that they're not just returning to flee again in 6 months.
Yes. If a city can't offer immediate safety, then all the other incentives, jobs, housing subsidies, they become meaningless.
And beyond that immediate physical safety, property rights are paramount. You said 10% of the housing stock is damaged or destroyed? There has to be a clear system for the millions of people whose homes are just gone.
This is a massive legal and logistical challenge. Without clear mechanisms for what they call restitution, compensation, or rebuilding, displaced people will hesitate.
They'll worry their homes will be seized or their documents won't be honored.
Exactly. The sources point toward establishing transparent digital property registries and clear compensation funds that treat returnees fairly, with a priority for families with children.
The housing approach itself has to shift quickly, from temporary shelters to long-term stable solutions. How does the plan propose to do that on such a large scale?
The strategy advocates for large public-private programs. The key policy tools are twofold. First, giving priority access to stable housing for families with children and for veterans. And second, using targeted rent support and mortgage subsidies. Things like reduced interest rates for families with children to make housing near schools and clinics affordable. The goal is to make homeownership or long-term rental a highly preferential option for families.
But a young, skilled couple abroad needs more than just a roof. They need an economic future. If they return to a depopulated area, it won't be a durable return unless there are jobs waiting for them.
Absolutely. The reconstruction itself has to be designed as an engine for local labor.
What does that mean in practice?
It means specific economic incentives, offering tax breaks for companies that invest in war-affected regions, providing direct wage subsidies for firms that hire returnees or IDPs. This strategy makes sure that the international funds for rebuilding immediately generate economic security.
It turns infrastructure projects into retention tools.
That's the idea.
I do wonder, though, if a focus on local labor will create friction with big international construction firms. They might want to bring in their own workers for efficiency.
That friction is inevitable, and managing it is a governance challenge. The sources suggest tying public procurement contracts to specific local hiring quotas. This way, you welcome international expertise, but the ultimate economic benefit employment stays in the communities trying to recover.
Finally, let's look at the huge practical challenge of bureaucracy. People returning or dealing with trauma, lost documents, confusing legal statuses.
Bureaucracy is a massive barrier to return, a huge one. The proposed solution is very practical. Establish return one-stop centers.
Where would these be?
Near the borders and in major cities. These centers are designed to consolidate all the necessary services in one place. Passport services, tax registration, social insurance enrollment, housing advice, school registration.
All under one roof.
Yes. And integrating these services digitally is critical, so a returnee doesn't spend weeks going back and forth between different government offices. Cutting red tape is a direct way to lower the barrier for millions of people to come home.
That structural framework sets the stage for Pillar 2, which aims directly at the deepest demographic wound, the fertility collapse. Pillar 2 is about supporting families and raising births.
This moves beyond just stability and into the realm of reproduction. With the TFR at 1 child per woman, making child rearing less costly, less anxious, and more socially supported is, well, it's paramount.
And the most immediate policy response is direct financial aid.
That's the lump sum birth payment of 50,000 hryvnias. It was adopted by law and is supposed to start in 2026.
Which is about $1,190.
Roughly, yes. It's helpful for those big upfront expenses, baby supplies, and so on. But the critical debate is whether that amount is really enough to move the needle on a major life decision.
Well, considering the average monthly salary in many parts of Ukraine might be around 15,000 to 20,000 UAH, 50,000 is a significant amount, several months' wages.
It is significant, but how the aid is targeted matters a lot, especially with the wartime budget constraints.
So it can't be a universal payment.
The suggestion is that the targeting must be precise. The cash transfers should ideally be weighted toward low and middle-income families, since they're the most sensitive to the initial costs of having a child.
And maybe increase it for a second or third child.
That's another idea. The decision to have a first child is often not about policy incentives, but policy can influence the decision to expand a family. But again, it all has to be done within a very tight budget.
And the massive challenge here, which the sources really highlight, is the competition from the social welfare systems in the EU countries.
This is the strategic hurdle. Many Ukrainian women with children in the EU have access to very generous family policies. Look at Poland's Family 800+ scheme. It pays 800 zloty, which is roughly $200 a month per child.
With very little bureaucracy.
Minimal. That is an enormous predictable source of income for a single mother. Ukraine right now just cannot match that kind of monthly commitment.
So if a war-strained economy can't match the EU's monthly cash payments, is competing on financial incentives even realistic? Or is it just symbolic?
The sources suggest the strategy has to shift. It can't just be about competing on cash. It has to be about improving the overall quality of life and work-family balance. Ukraine must reduce the gap by improving non-monetary support.
And what kind of non-monetary supports are detailed in the plan?
Things like legal mandates for flexible working hours, strong frameworks for remote work so mothers can stay in the labor force, and critically, providing tax incentives for companies that run or fund childcare.
So, quality daycare.
Subsidized, reliable, quality daycare. It's essential for retaining skilled women in the workforce, women who might otherwise stay in the EU where those systems are already well established.
The psychological safety of giving birth is another huge hurdle, tied directly to the physical scars of the war.
Which is why the strategy makes maternity and perinatal care a high priority in reconstruction. It demands specific infrastructure upgrades.
Meaning what?
It means making sure medical facilities don't just have modern operating theaters, but also guaranteed backup power and certified accessible bomb shelters. If a family knows the hospital where their child will be born is protected, it removes a huge layer of fear.
The sources also mention integrating trauma-sensitive counseling for expectant mothers. Why is that so important for demographic recovery?
Because the stress of a wartime pregnancy, the separation from a partner, the constant sirens, it all significantly increases the risk of maternal anxiety and can lead to adverse birth outcomes.
So this is a medical intervention.
It is. Integrating stigma-free trauma counseling helps stabilize pregnancies and provides essential support for early parenting. This leads to stronger, more stable families. It addresses the emotional wounds of war that prevent new life.
And finally, Pillar 2 also has to address the enormous population of veterans and their families. Their stability is tied directly to future population growth.
The scale here is staggering. Ukraine currently has around 880,000 soldiers. When they demobilize, estimates suggest the country could have as many as 5 million veterans and their family members who need comprehensive reintegration support.
A tenth of the population or more.
At least. And if these individuals return with untreated trauma, PTSD, or moral injury, it puts immense strain on marriages. It leads to instability, divorce, and a reluctance to start new families or have more children.
So the strategy has to be proactive. It has to link veteran stability directly to future family growth. What support is planned for this group?
The sources emphasize providing free, stigma-free counseling for couples, not just for the veteran alone.
That's a key distinction.
It is, and this is complemented by prioritized housing schemes that are linked to job placement. The premise is simple. When veterans see the state is supporting them in building a stable home life, the trauma is less likely to destroy their family.
Making them more likely to commit to marriage and raising children inside Ukraine.
Yes.
This transitions us perfectly into strategic Pillar 3, rebuilding human capital and the workforce. This is the long-term project. Restoring skills, productivity, and making sure that investment in education actually stays within the nation.
Pillar 3 is all about making sure that Ukrainians choose to stay rather than to leave. It's the defense against brain drain. And that starts with repairing the systems that produce skilled workers, beginning with the education system itself.
The physical rebuilding is critical safe classrooms, bomb shelters. But the strategy also has to tackle the immense learning losses from years of remote or interrupted school.
That is the core challenge. The strategy calls for implementing national tutoring schemes, large-scale subsidized programs, and what they call bridging programs.
What's a bridging program?
It's things like extra instruction in the Ukrainian language and aligning curricula to ease the transition for children coming back from schools abroad where they might have been learning in Polish or German. It's also about recognizing foreign academic degrees and diplomas to smooth their reentry.
There's also the crucial question of retaining talent after they're educated. If the state heavily subsidizes a university education, how does it stop that graduate from immediately emigrating and benefiting a foreign economy?
This is a tricky point and a critical policy lever. The strategy addresses it by tying university scholarships and fee waivers to a period of work inside Ukraine after graduation.
A kind of national service for graduates?
In a way, it's a mechanism to ensure that public investment in higher education feeds directly back into the national labor pool.
But doesn't a policy like that, tying scholarships to domestic work, risk creating a brain trap? Doesn't it discourage the most ambitious students who might feel restricted compared to their peers in the West?
That is the exact ethical and practical trade-off the government has to manage. It's necessary to prevent a total loss of talent, but the policy has to be flexible. Perhaps the work commitment is only for high-demand, reconstruction-focused fields. Or it could have specific exceptions. If the commitment period is too long or the pay is too low, it risks driving the next generation to seek their education abroad from the start, just to avoid the restriction.
The goal is retention, not coercion.
Precisely.
Shifting to the labor market, the sources pointed out a paradox. Projected unemployment was high, around 14% in 2024, but at the same time, firms were struggling to find workers with the right skills.
It's a classic skills mismatch, just amplified by the war. The conflict changed the labor force, and the skills people have don't align with the urgent needs of the post-war economy.
Which are?
Heavy construction, energy grid repair, logistics, and elder care. The clear task is a massive reorganization of vocational training.
What specific type of training does the strategy emphasize to fix this mismatch quickly?
The emphasis is on large-scale, practice-oriented training. This means short courses and intensive apprenticeships that are linked directly to real jobs in high-demand sectors like welding, heavy equipment operation, nursing, and rehabilitation therapy.
It has to be fast and lead directly to a job.
Fast, certified, and linked immediately to employment subsidies to ensure people get into the workforce quickly.
The Ukrainian diaspora, those millions of refugees, they're also a huge potential asset. How does the strategy actively engage them?
We know that 70% of the refugees had work experience before the invasion, which makes them highly desirable. The strategy has to go beyond just vague encouragement and actively incentivize their return. This is where the return packages come in.
What exactly are these return packages? What do they offer?
They're multifaceted. They would include things like relocation grants to cover moving costs, accelerated recognition of foreign academic degrees and professional qualifications, and active help with finding housing and school placements.
A concierge service for return.
In a way, yes. And for those who stay abroad but want to invest, the state needs to facilitate networks for them so their skills stay connected to Ukrainian projects even before they physically come back.
Does the strategy talk about bringing in foreign labor to fill the most acute gaps, especially for those massive construction projects?
It does, but cautiously. Limited managed immigration of foreign workers might be necessary for severe shortages, like in construction or elder care, to prevent bottlenecks that would slow down reconstruction.
But there's a risk there.
A big one. The governance framework insists that these workers must have clear, transparent rules on residency, family reunification, and labor rights. This is to prevent creating a temporary marginalized workforce and to uphold labor standards.
Finally, digitalization plays a big role here, both for governance and for supporting the workforce.
Extending e-government services cuts a lot of red tape. It lowers the barrier to starting a business or receiving social benefits. And critically, the growth of remote work infrastructure lets Ukrainians inside the country work for foreign employers,
Bringing in higher than average wages.
Exactly. And for refugees, it lets them keep their links with Ukrainian companies before they return, bridging that geographical and employment gap.
Okay, so we've covered the diagnosis, the immense cost, and the three practical pillars. Now we have to address the systems that hold all of this together: governance, finance, and ethical sustainability. Without good stewardship, no amount of money or strategy will work.
This is the anchor. The first condition for securing the trust of donors, and more importantly, the trust of citizens, is credible financial governance and anti-corruption. Transparency is non-negotiable.
And the sources highlight Ukraine's progress here, pointing to a system that was already in place before 2022. The Prozoro e-procurement platform. How does that work in practice?
Prozoro, which has been around since 2014, is a really powerful anti-corruption tool. It openly publishes all public tender data.
All of it.
Everything. Who bid for how much and who won the contract for reconstruction projects or government purchasing. It mandates electronic auctions for most government contracts, which severely limits the ability of officials to rig bids.
So how does that transparency actually save money and prevent corruption?
By forcing competitive bidding and making the whole process public, it stops common corruption tactics like single bid contracts or massively inflated prices. Auditors and NGOs can track it all in real time.
Which acts as a deterrent.
A powerful one. The sources report that Prozoro has saved billions by increasing competition. And when citizens see that their benefits are being managed transparently and are reaching real people, they are far more likely to trust the system.
And choose to return and stay and invest their lives there.
Exactly.
The path toward European Union membership also acts as a strong anchor for these kinds of reform.
Absolutely. Ukraine got EU candidate status in June 2022, and accession talks opened in December 2023. This path requires wide-ranging reforms, not just in the rule of law, but also in labor law, social protection, and public administration.
And how does aligning social policies with the EU specifically close that immigration gap we talked about earlier?
EU alignment means improvements in worker safety standards, wage expectations, and standardized social benefits. It makes working in Ukraine more predictable and appealing. It reduces the systemic differences that push skilled labor to go to EU member states.
And long-term, EU accession would bring access to structural funds,
which can then finance more of these critical regional recovery and demographic projects.
The governance strategy also has to account for how different the needs are across the country. Can't be a one-size-fits-all approach.
No. The damage and needs vary drastically. The East has heavy destruction, while the West is struggling with massive IDP inflows. So the requirement is to establish regional demographic monitoring units.
Local bodies to track data.
Yes. Tracking granular indicators, births, deaths, school enrollment, local unemployment rates.
And how is that data then used to implement policy?
This local data gets fed into a map-based system. It visualizes the damage and service gaps in real time. This lets planners adjust subsidies, investments, and housing incentives based on local needs.
So a Western region with lots of IDPs might get more housing subsidies,
while an Eastern region undergoing demining might get prioritized job training subsidies. It ensures money is spent where the demographic impact is greatest, not just spread evenly.
Finally, we have to return to the ethical constraints that have to guide all of this demographic policy. The sources stress the absolute necessity of respecting human dignity.
This is a critical ethical principle. The policies have to respect that each family retains the right to decide where they live and how many children they have.
The state has to avoid any language or mechanism that feels like coercion.
Yes, it can't feel like pressure to raise births or rush a return just to hit some government target. Citizens have to be treated as moral agents, not just instruments in a demographic campaign.
And fairness is essential to keep social cohesion, especially with the stress between different groups, like returning veterans and others.
Financial support has to be available across all social classes and regions, and it has to rely on open, neutral criteria like income level or displacement status. Transparency in who gets what is vital to prevent resentment.
To prevent a feeling that veterans get priority for housing over, say, a childless couple who also lost their home.
Exactly. Publishing clear criteria builds trust and maintains the social contract.
And the way officials talk about these plans matters just as much as the policies themselves.
The sources highlight that. Officials have to frame this demographic recovery not as a cold project about numbers, but as a project that makes it possible for families to stay together, for children to grow up without constant sirens, and for veterans to find peace and stability.
It connects the huge fiscal and governance plans back to everyday human hope.
And it helps rebuild trust in the state's ability to actually care for its citizens.
This deep dive has really shown us that Ukraine's recovery is a multi-layered challenge. It demands the strategic coordination of security, finance, social welfare, and education. We started with the sheer scale of the displacement crisis, those 10.5 to 10.7 million uprooted people, and the enormous $486 billion price tag for recovery.
And we analyzed how the strategy rests on those three pillars, building that community around the restored population river. First, creating secure and livable conditions for return through safety, property rights, and local jobs.
Second, supporting families to raise birth by strategically competing with EU benefits and stabilizing veteran families.
And third, rebuilding human capital through repaired schools, targeted job training, and actively engaging the global diaspora.
This is a generational effort. It's going to stretch over decades, and it's all anchored in the credibility of the state, which is ensured through anti-corruption tools like Prozoro and the rigor demanded by the EU accession process.
So the final question, the one for you, the listener, to contemplate now is this. Given the deep historical decline in birth rates, which was happening long before the war, and recognizing the stability and generous benefits available just across the border in the European Union, what single specific domestic policy, beyond just relying on foreign aid, will prove to be the most potent factor in persuading a young, skilled couple to forego the security of the EU and instead build their lives and their family within the borders of Ukraine?
That decision is where the fate of the nation really rests. A challenging thought. Thank you for guiding us through this immense strategic analysis.
My pleasure.
This has been a deep dive from reform thinking into Ukraine's multi-billion-dollar strategy for demographic recovery. We hope this analysis provides you with a clear and detailed understanding of the challenges and the comprehensive long-term policy response being deployed.